In this video, I'm going to give you 7 tips to improve your Webflow forms. Tip number 1 is a simple method to improve your Webflow form submit buttons. Right here, I have created a really cool button, which when I hover over it, the gap disappears and kind of animates together, kind of like a magnetic button. I think that's a really cool effect. The problem, however, is I cannot use that as a button element. Right now, this is a link block, and if I try to turn this into a form button that actually submits the form, I'm going to show you what happens. So I'm going to add a form button here and try to give it the same class, so custom button. And then I try to put these nested elements inside of it. You can see it doesn't work because the form button cannot have other elements inside of it. So that's why this button is very limited. I can give it my normal button class, but then it doesn't look very interesting. There's a great solution for it. What I can do is I'm going to add a new element to the page, and that is a custom element. Then go to the settings and set the tag to button. So now this becomes a Webflow HTML button element. Then I set an attribute of type and set it to the value submit, so that this will submit the form when it is clicked. And now inside of this element, I can put other elements. So if I give this the class of custom button and put it in front of the old custom button, which was a link block, which looks like a button but doesn't submit the form, then I take the original nested elements and put it into the new form submit button, delete everything else. And now this works just like a normal submit button, except it has this really cool styling and advanced layout that wouldn't be possible with the normal form submit button. Tip number 2 is learn to style your radio buttons and checkboxes in Webflow. The default radio button and checkbox stylings, they don't really look that great. They look quite boring actually. And most people, they don't go much beyond the default styling. So they might add a little bit of padding and maybe a color here and make it a little larger, the check icon, but that's about it. But with just a little bit of effort, you can take these radio buttons and checkboxes and turn them into something really cool and interesting. So for example, right here, I'm on a live site of a Webflow form, and these things right here, they are radio buttons. And there's no custom code involved here. They're just normal Webflow radio buttons that have been styled in the background. Here's another example. This is also a form built in Webflow. You can see here I have these radio buttons that are really interesting. Or here I have another form. Here you can see this is a much simpler design, but already this looks much better than just the default radio button and checkbox styling. And the way how you can do this is actually quite simple. You just have to know these radio buttons and checkboxes are styled in almost the exact same way. They always come in this structure that they have a wrapper element called checkbox field, then the checkbox icon and the checkbox label. And now you can just go ahead and style them like any other Webflow element. So I give this a checkbox wrapper, for example, checkbox wrapper class. Then I give it a background of white. Then I give it some padding, let's say 0.5 rem on each side. Then I go to the checkbox icon, give it a class of checkbox icon, add a little bit of spacing. And this way your radio buttons and checkboxes will look much more interesting and engaging. Tip number 3. Start to build multi-step forms. So right here, I have quite a large Webflow form. And if we go to the live side of this, you can see if a website visitor comes to this page and is confronted with a giant form like this, they are going to feel overwhelmed. Nobody wants to fill out a huge form like this. But in practice, it is often necessary to have larger forms with lots of different inputs. So my recommendation to you is whenever you have a form that has more than 7, 8 inputs, then you can start to split it up into multiple steps. And then suddenly a large form like this that is really overwhelming turns into a much more interesting form like this. This is the exact same form, also built entirely inside of Webflow. It is just split up into multiple steps. I can now click through the form. I can fill out the fields step by step. It is much more palatable. And up here, I even have a progress indicator to see where I'm currently at in the form. And we have these nice radio buttons. If I forget to make a selection, I even get a validation message. And the best thing about these multi-step forms is that you can build them 100% inside of the Webflow designer with a Webflow app that I have created called InputFlow. And InputFlow basically allows you to take any normal Webflow form and with a few clicks turn it into a really cool and interesting multi-step form. And then you can add validation, branching, logic, calculations, and much more. If that is interesting to you, I've actually recorded an entire video tutorial about how you can build multi-step forms in Webflow, and you can check it out here on my YouTube channel. Tip number 4 is start to use special input elements. So right here I have a form called Become a Supporter, and it has a name, a country, and a message field. And the country field, I think this is just a normal Webflow form field. Yes, you can see the type in the text field settings is set to plain. You have a few other options here. You have email, password, phone, number, or URL. But actually in the browser in HTML, there are much more input types than just the 6 that we see here on the screen. To use them and enable some additional functionality, what you can do is, I'm going to add a custom element. This is quite a new element from Webflow. And set the tag to input in the settings panel so that it becomes a HTML input element. Then I give it an attribute of type equals, let's say, date. We want to create a date field here. Then I give it a name called date of birth and another attribute called data name and also date of birth. And now I'm going to replace this one right here. Let's change the label. And then I'm going to give this a class form input. This is the input class that I used for this project. And now this looks like a normal Webflow form element, except it includes some default browser functionality. And we can see this, for example, here with this date field, input type date. If I go to the preview and click this icon, there is now a date selection picker, which is really cool. And you don't have to do anything extra for this. There's no custom code involved. This is built into any browser by default. And you can do other interesting things. For example, we could turn this into an input type equals color. And once we do that and go to the preview, you can see now we have a color picker. Just like this without writing any custom code, because this is already built into HTML and the browser. And you can Google, there are a lot more interesting input types. And with these, you can take your Webflow forms to the next level. Tip number 5 is use labels for every Webflow form. This is actually quite a boring tip. However, if you do not follow this tip, actually starting from this year, you could get fined in some countries if you don't use labels. And with labels, I mean these field labels that label every form input element. And this is really important for accessibility. First of all, it makes it easier for visitors who need assistive technologies to navigate your website and your form, but also for users without the need for assistive technologies. These labels make it much more obvious what the individual fields are for, instead of just using the placeholders. More and more countries are enforcing this. For example, in the EU, there's the EU Accessibility Act. So in more and more countries, you will have to do that by law. And actually, these labels are a good idea. I don't build any forms without proper input labels. Tip number 6 is stop using Webflow's reCAPTCHA. This is the anti-spam element that you can use inside of Webflow forms, but this has lots of different issues. First of all, it looks really ugly from a design perspective. I wouldn't want to have that in my form, but also it's quite an accessibility nightmare, a usability nightmare, and also a privacy nightmare, because this reCAPTCHA is from Google and sends data to the Google servers. Additionally, on top of all that problems, this is an outdated version of Google's reCAPTCHA that Webflow has implemented here. Google has already released a much better and updated version, but inside of Webflow, there's still this old version. So I would not use this for spam protection inside of Webflow anymore. What you can do instead is, you can go to your site settings, and inside of forms, inside of the forms section, you can turn on the new Webflow bot protection. So as you can see here, there's a bot option to protect against bots, and you can turn it from off to on. And then this will be a much more effective way to protect against spam. And tip number 7 is a simple trick to style your Webflow select elements. So as you can see, this right here, this country field is a select dropdown. However, it doesn't look really great. If I go to the preview, you can see I can click on it and I can make a dropdown selection. However, this dropdown arrow, this default one by Webflow, is really, really small. I need a telescope to see it. And this icon is way too far to the right, so it just doesn't look good. And most people, or a lot of people, actually leave this at the default. But what you can do is, you can just give this select element the same class as your input elements. Then inside of the style settings, you can add a combo class, for example, select for the select element. And then you can go to the custom properties, add an appearance none. This hides the default drop-down arrow. And then you can use this trick. You can go to backgrounds and add a new background image. And for the image, you just choose an SVG, a custom drop-down arrow that you can create. I've created this one in Figma. And then you set the tiling to not tile. Then you set the position to middle right. And then you change the percentage here from 100 to 98. Usually that works really well. And then you can change the size of this icon. Let's set this to 0.8 rem. And now we have this custom drop-down arrow. And this already looks much better and also much more like a drop-down than the default one. And another strategy to take your Webflow forms to the next level, I already mentioned today in the video, is you can turn your forms into really cool multi-step forms. And to learn how to do that in Webflow, you can just click on the video that I will show here on the screen, because I've actually recorded an entire tutorial how you can build multi-step forms in Webflow, and you can click on it and watch it right now. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Mike. Have a great day. Bye.